Why did Rome, a city that began as a cluster of huts on the banks of the Tiber, rise to command the greatest army the ancient world had ever seen? And perhaps more importantly, what secret methods turned ordinary men into weapons so disciplined, so merciless, that their enemies often surrendered at the mere sight of them? This isn't a story of simple conquest. It's a story of transformation, of raw recruits molded into legionaries through brutal training rituals, unbreakable discipline, and a culture that demanded absolute sacrifice. Consider the battlefield at Cannae in 216 BCE. Dust clouds rise as tens of thousands of Roman soldiers advance in perfect formation. Their red cloaks snap in the wind, shields glinting like a wall of iron. They march forward with confidence. After all, the legions have never known defeat on this scale. Yet, within hours, they will be encircled, crushed, and annihilated by Hannibal's Carthaginian army. More than 50,000 Romans will lie dead in the dust. And yet, Rome will not collapse. Rome will not surrender. Instead, it will adapt, harden, and eventually rise stronger than before. This is the paradox of Rome's power. Defeat did not break it. Defeat was fuel. The secret lay in a system of training and discipline so merciless that survival itself forged men into unyielding warriors. But where did this system come from? And how did it work in practice?
To understand this, we must step back to Rome's early days. In the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, Rome was little more than a regional power, hemmed in by rival tribes, Etruscans, Samnites, and Gauls. These enemies were fierce, unpredictable, and often militarily superior. Rome's survival depended not on brilliance, but on relentless adaptation. Unlike the Greeks, who perfected the rigid phalanx, the Romans developed something more flexible, more enduring: the legion. But the legion was nothing without the men who filled its ranks. And those men had to be remade. Roman military culture believed that soldiers weren't born, they were engineered. A farmer's son might arrive at camp carrying little more than a wooden plow, but within months he would march 20 miles under the weight of iron armor, build a fortified camp in a single day, and then fight with a discipline so cold and mechanical that enemies described the legions as a machine made of flesh and steel. Archaeological evidence from Roman training camps, such as Vindolanda near Hadrian's Wall, reveals just how rigorous this process was. Excavations have uncovered wooden swords, deliberately heavier than real ones, designed to overtrain the muscles of recruits. Inscriptions detail grueling marches, punishing drills, and punishments that could end in death. Discipline wasn't merely strict, it was absolute.
But why such cruelty? The answer lies in strategy. Rome understood that the strength of its empire would never come from numbers alone. Other civilizations had vast armies. Other peoples had brilliant generals. Rome's genius was institutional. It created a system in which every soldier was interchangeable, every unit reliable, and every legion capable of fighting without hesitation. The price of this reliability was merciless discipline. Picture the initiation of a recruit. He enters the camp gates for the first time. The smell of sweat, leather, and smoke hangs heavy. He is stripped of his civilian clothing and handed military gear. His hair is cut, his old identity erased. From this moment forward, he is no longer an individual. He is a legionary, bound to the state, answerable to his centurion. And the centurion does not forgive weakness. Failure in training was punished with flogging.
Cowardice in battle could bring execution by decimatio, where every 10th man in a disgraced unit was clubbed to death by his comrades. Imagine the psychological impact. Your survival depended not only on your courage, but on the courage of the man beside you. If he faltered, you might die for his weakness. It was a system designed to ensure that no one ever broke ranks. And yet, this brutality had a strange effect. It bound men together. Soldiers came to see each other as brothers forged in the same fire. Archaeological inscriptions often refer to comradeship as the soldier's greatest treasure. They marched, fought, and died as one. This was the secret alchemy of Rome's training rituals, cruelty that produced cohesion. Strategically, the results were devastating. Rome's enemies faced not a collection of individuals, but a living machine. At Sentinum in 295 BCE, during the Samnite Wars, the Romans faced a coalition army of Samnites, Gauls, and Etruscans. Outnumbered and pressed hard, the Romans did not break. Instead, they held formation, adapted tactics mid-battle, and eventually crushed the enemy coalition. Contemporary accounts describe the Roman line as unyielding as iron, while the coalition forces, less disciplined, fractured and fled. But military power was only part of the story. Behind every victory lay the political engine of the Republic. Rome's Senate understood that military strength was inseparable from political control. Recruits were drawn from citizens who owed service to the state. Their loyalty was not to a king, but to the Republic itself, a system that promised land, wealth, and citizenship as rewards. This created a powerful incentive structure. Service was brutal, but the rewards could transform a man's family for generations.
And yet, the system carried seeds of danger. If men fought for Rome because Rome rewarded them, what happened when generals began offering more than the state? This question would haunt Rome centuries later, leading to the rise of figures like Marius, Sulla, and Caesar. But in these early centuries, the system worked, producing soldiers who were not only hardened fighters, but also symbols of Roman power. Consider the psychological warfare this created. For enemies, the sight of a Roman camp was demoralizing. Camps were built with mathematical precision, square layouts, ditches, palisades. They rose overnight, transforming landscapes into Roman territory. Archaeological remains of these camps stretch across Europe, silent testimony to a system that projected dominance even without battle. Enemies knew that wherever the legions went, Rome followed. And yet Rome's success was never guaranteed. The early republic faced near annihilation more than once. In 390 BCE, a Gallic horde sacked Rome itself. The city burned. Survivors retreated to the Capitoline Hill, watching helplessly as their world collapsed. But Rome rebuilt. It reorganized. It reformed its military structure, hardened its training, and emerged stronger. Where other states might have perished, Rome turned disaster into transformation. This resilience became a defining feature of Roman warfare. Defeat was never the end, only the beginning of adaptation. So when we ask, what secret training rituals made Rome's soldiers merciless? The answer is complex. It was not one ritual, but an entire system. Brutality that bred unity, punishment that ensured discipline, training that turned exhaustion into second nature, and above all, a culture that demanded absolute service to the state. But this raises a deeper question. Was this merciless discipline the key to Rome's rise, or the seed of its eventual downfall? By binding soldiers so tightly to the system, did Rome create an unstoppable machine, or a weapon that could one day turn inward? In the centuries ahead, This question would be tested again and again, on foreign battlefields, in political chambers, and eventually on the very streets of Rome itself.
Training was relentless. Recruits were taught to march 20 miles in full armor, carrying packs of 60 pounds or more. The pace was punishing, a forced march designed to weed out the weak. Drills were repeated until reflex replaced thought. Wooden practice swords, deliberately twice as heavy as real weapons, were used to strengthen arms. Shields were slammed together in formation until the sound shook the camp like thunder. By the time a recruit reached the battlefield, he no longer thought of fatigue, hunger, or fear. His body moved automatically, trained to obey commands without hesitation. Discipline was absolute. Punishment was not symbolic, but physical, brutal, and often final. Cowards were executed, thieves were stoned by their comrades. Units that broke in battle could face decimation, where every 10th man was beaten to death by his brothers. The message was clear: your life depended on the discipline of the whole. If one man failed, all suffered. This system forged bonds of loyalty, not just to Rome, but to the unit. A legionary knew that the man to his left and right had endured the same trials and faced the same punishments. Strategically, this produced something remarkable: reliability. Roman commanders could count on their soldiers to hold formation, to obey under pressure, to act as one body. Ancient historians often remarked that Rome did not always field the bravest warriors or the most skilled swordsmen. Instead, Rome fielded the most dependable machine. This reliability meant that even in the chaos of battle, legions could adapt to changing conditions. Weapons played their part too. The Roman gladius was short, designed not for wide slashing like the barbarian sword, but for stabbing in close quarters. Roman training emphasized thrusts to the torso and abdomen, efficient and deadly. The pilum, a heavy throwing spear, was engineered with a soft iron shank. When it struck a shield, it bent, making the shield useless and preventing the enemy from throwing the weapon back. The scutum, the iconic Roman shield, was a curved rectangle that offered both protection and offensive capability. In formation, scuta locked together into an impenetrable wall.
The Romans were engineers as much as soldiers. Every march ended with the construction of a fortified camp, complete with ditches, palisades, and gates, built in astonishing speed. These camps were not only defensive, but psychological weapons. Enemies saw them and understood Rome was not merely passing through. Rome was here to stay. Archaeological remains of such camps can still be found across Europe, from Britain to Germany to the Middle East, a silent testimony to Rome's military engineering. Consider the testudo formation, where soldiers interlocked shields above and in front to create a shell-like barrier. Under this moving fortress, they could advance against archers or storm fortifications. It was not invincible, but it was terrifying. Enemies often broke ranks at the sight of this slow, inexorable advance. But Rome's true strength wasn't in any single weapon or tactic. It was in the system's adaptability. After the disaster at Cannae, where Hannibal annihilated Roman forces, Rome didn't collapse. Instead, it changed its strategy. Under Fabius Maximus, Rome adopted guerrilla tactics, avoiding pitched battles, harassing the enemy, starving them of resources. This flexibility allowed Rome to outlast Hannibal. No other ancient power could adapt so quickly, precisely because no other had built such a resilient military machine. The human cost was high. Soldiers were often away from families for decades. Many never returned. Letters preserved on wax tablets, found at Vindolanda, describe men begging for more socks, sandals, or simply a letter from home. These fragments remind us that behind the iron discipline,
These were human beings enduring hunger, exhaustion, and isolation. And yet, they fought on, not always out of loyalty to the Republic, but because survival depended on obedience.
And here lies the paradox of Rome's machine. It was merciless, but it worked. Other civilizations raised armies through charisma, religion, or temporary need. Rome created a permanent military institution. Soldiers were not just fighters, they were builders, engineers, administrators. They spread Roman culture as much as they spread Roman power. Now, consider this. Would you, as a young recruit, endure 20 years of brutal service for the promise of land at the end? Or would you rather face punishment, dishonor, even execution, than break under the weight of that discipline? This was the choice every Roman soldier faced, and most chose service, because in Rome, to serve was to exist. The genius of Rome's military machine wasn't just its efficiency, it was its inevitability. Enemies could win battles, but Rome always returned, always rebuilt, always adapted. Because Rome's army wasn't just an army, it was Rome itself, marching forward. But while the system gave Rome its edge, it also planted a dangerous seed. As soldiers grew more loyal to their commanders than to the Senate, the balance of power began to shift. The machine could be turned not only against Rome's enemies, but against Rome itself. And that is where our story leads next, to battles where the enemy was not across the field, but inside the Republic.
Why did Rome suffer one of the worst defeats in its history at the hands of Hannibal? And more importantly, how did this disaster become the foundation for Rome's later supremacy? To answer, we must walk onto the killing field of Cannae, a battlefield that became a graveyard for nearly an entire generation of Roman warriors. The year was 216 BCE, deep in the Second Punic War. Rome and Carthage had already fought for decades over dominance of the Mediterranean. Hannibal Barca, Carthage's greatest general, had shocked the world by crossing the Alps with elephants and shattering Roman armies at the Trebia and Lake Trasimene. Yet Rome still refused to yield. Determined to crush Hannibal once and for all, the Senate assembled the largest force it had ever fielded, nearly 80,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry. Facing them was Hannibal's smaller army of about 50,000. On paper, Rome should have won. But wars are not decided by numbers alone. They are decided by strategy. At the heart of Rome's army stood its consuls, Lucius Aemilius Paulus, cautious and experienced, and Gaius Terentius Varro, bold and ambitious. Each commanded the army on alternate days, a dangerous arrangement that reflected political compromise rather than military wisdom. Varro, eager for glory, pushed for battle on his day of command. Paulus counseled caution, but his voice was drowned out by the roar of Rome's confidence. Now imagine standing in the Roman ranks that morning. The dust of southern Italy swirls in the hot August air. You hear the commands shouted down the line, feel the press of bodies on either side, and see the enemy drawn up across the field. Hannibal has placed his men in a crescent-shaped formation, a subtle trap masked as weakness. At its center are his weaker Iberian and Gallic infantry. On the wings stand his hardened African veterans, and on the flanks, his superior cavalry. Most Romans did not see the danger. They saw only an enemy who looked ready to collapse.
When the battle began, the Roman infantry surged forward, pressing into the center of Hannibal's crescent. It seemed to work. The Carthaginian line bent backward, step by step, retreating under the Roman onslaught. Varro believed victory was near, but what he saw as weakness was in fact deliberate design. Hannibal was pulling Rome deeper, stretching their formation tighter, drawing them into the jaws of his trap. Meanwhile, on the flanks,
Hannibal's cavalry struck. On the Roman left, his Numidian horsemen harassed relentlessly, preventing Roman riders from maneuvering. On the right, Carthaginian heavy cavalry smashed through the Roman equites, driving them from the field. With the Roman cavalry scattered, Hannibal's horsemen wheeled behind the Roman infantry, sealing their fate. The Carthaginian wings of African veterans now pivoted inward, striking the Roman flanks. What had been an overwhelming advance turned into encirclement. The Roman army, packed tightly in its massive block, could no longer maneuver. Shields clashed uselessly against comrades, swords swung without space to strike. Hemmed in on all sides, Rome's mighty army became a slaughter pen.
Ancient sources describe the horror. Men suffocated in the crush before ever meeting a blade. Corpses piled so high that soldiers stumbled over the dead while trying to fight. Livy writes that some Romans, unable to raise their arms, were cut down where they stood, while others, desperate to escape, dug holes in the ground and buried their heads to suffocate rather than face the slaughter. By nightfall, as many as 50,000 Romans lay dead. It was the darkest day in Roman military history. And yet, in this disaster, Rome revealed something extraordinary. Other nations might have sued for peace. Indeed, Carthage expected Rome to negotiate surrender. Instead, Rome chose resilience. The Senate refused to discuss peace. The survivors were reorganized. Cities that wavered in loyalty were punished, and new armies were raised. Rome understood that even the worst defeat could be endured if the system held. Strategically, the lesson was clear. Rome had relied on brute force and numbers, but Hannibal had mastered maneuver and deception. The Romans would not forget this. In the years that followed, they adapted, avoiding pitched battles with Hannibal and instead cutting off his supply lines, wearing him down through attrition. The man who had annihilated Roman legions would eventually be forced into retreat, not because of one decisive battle, but because Rome refused to collapse after Cannae.
But the human drama of Cannae cannot be ignored. Consider the consuls themselves. Paulus, the cautious general, died fighting with his men, cut down in the chaos. Varro, the impulsive commander whose decision led to disaster, survived, but returned to Rome in shame. And yet, instead of punishing him, the Senate thanked him. Why? Because he had not despaired. He had lived to fight another day, and Rome valued endurance more than perfection. Archaeological evidence adds vivid detail. Excavations near Cannae have uncovered fragments of weapons and mass graves, silent reminders of the slaughter. Skeletal remains show wounds from both blades and blunt force, evidence of the suffocating crush of men packed too tightly to fight. These bones tell the story not of glory, but of survival, or rather, the lack of it. For modern strategists, Cannae remains a textbook case of the double envelopment maneuver. Military academies still study Hannibal's tactics, seeing in them the perfect execution of encirclement. Napoleon, Schlieffen, and even modern generals have cited Cannae as inspiration. But what's equally instructive is Rome's response. Where other nations broke, Rome endured. Where others sued for peace, Rome fought on. Trap closed, or would you have fled, knowing that flight meant dishonor and likely death at the hands of your comrades? What choice would you make when the system itself demanded sacrifice? Cannae was not the end of Rome, but its rebirth. The Republic learned that blind aggression was not enough. It learned patience, strategy, and the value of adaptability. And from that crucible came the Rome that would dominate the Mediterranean for centuries. But the lesson of Cannae was not only military. It also exposed the growing tension between political ambition and military necessity. Varro's rashness had been driven by personal glory as much as strategy. In Rome,
Politics and war were inseparable, a dangerous mix that would, in time, prove just as deadly as any foreign enemy. And that brings us to the next chapter in our story, the political intrigue and power struggles that turned Rome's own leaders into its greatest threat.
Why did the Roman Republic, a system built on checks and balances, repeatedly fall victim to ambitious generals who bent politics to their will? And why did those same political games often matter more than victories on the battlefield? The answer lies in understanding Rome's true battleground, the Senate, the Forum, and the shadowy networks of patronage that decided who commanded armies, who governed provinces, and who lived or died under the shadow of ambition. By the late Republic, military command had become inseparable from politics. Generals weren't simply soldiers, they were politicians in armor. Every victory on campaign translated into clout back in Rome, and every defeat gave rivals ammunition to destroy them. Consider Gaius Marius. He rose from humble beginnings, wielding his military success against Jugurtha in Numidia as a political weapon. But his reforms, arming Rome's poorest citizens, shifted the balance of power. Now legions were loyal not to the Senate, not even to the Republic itself, but to the general who promised them land and plunder. Marius turned soldiers into political clients, and in doing so gave birth to a new, dangerous reality: legions as personal power blocks. Here lies the tactical question. What happens to a republic when its soldiers fight not for the state, but for the man who commands them?
The Optimates, Rome's conservative elite, saw themselves as guardians of tradition, but in practice they jealously guarded power for their own families. Opposing them stood the populares, men like Marius and later Caesar, who appealed directly to the people, bypassing aristocratic privilege. The clash between these factions was more than political ideology. It was strategic warfare, waged with trials, vetoes, and alliances as deadly as swords on a battlefield. In the Senate, words could be as lethal as Pila. A failed speech, a miscalculated alliance, or a scandal at the wrong moment could end a career or a life. Consider the rivalry of Marius and Sulla. Once comrades, they became sworn enemies, each leveraging his armies to secure power in Rome. In 88 BC, when Sulla was denied command against Mithridates of Pontus, he didn't accept Senate authority. He marched on Rome with his legions, an unthinkable act until then. Imagine the shock. Roman soldiers killing Roman citizens, not on foreign soil, but in the streets of their own capital. The Republic's unwritten rules, its sacred boundaries, were shattered. This was more than a coup. It was a tactical revelation. The true prize wasn't foreign conquest, it was Rome itself.
If Sulla's march on Rome broke the taboo, Julius Caesar perfected it. Caesar understood that politics was about timing, momentum, and the careful balancing of enemies. His alliance with Pompey the Great and Crassus in the so-called First Triumvirate wasn't born of friendship, it was born of necessity. Each man supplied what the others lacked. Pompey with military prestige, Crassus with wealth, Caesar with political cunning. But alliances in Rome were always fragile, and ambition was a corrosive acid. Once Crassus fell in the east, the balance tilted. Pompey leaned toward the Senate, while Caesar, fresh from victories in Gaul, held something more valuable than political alliances: the undying loyalty of his legions. And here came the pivotal decision. The Senate ordered Caesar to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. He knew what that meant. Stripped of command, he'd be vulnerable to prosecution and exile. But with his army, he was untouchable. So he made the choice that would change history, crossing the Rubicon. Alea jacta est, the die is cast. It wasn't just a march, it was a declaration that Caesar's fate and Rome's would be decided not in courts,
but in civil war.
Politics in Rome was theater, sometimes literal, with gladiatorial games and public feasts used to curry favor. But beneath the spectacle lay cold strategy. Every alliance was temporary, every friendship conditional. Cicero, master of rhetoric, wielded words like weapons, his speeches demolishing reputations with the precision of a general breaking an enemy line. Yet even Cicero learned that clever words weren't always enough. When the conspirator Catiline plotted to overthrow the Republic, Cicero exposed him before the Senate, a political ambush that saved the state, temporarily. But years later, Cicero himself would fall to the proscriptions of Antony and Octavian, his eloquence no shield against the ruthless tide of power. The lesson was clear. In Rome, political intrigue could lift a man to the heavens or dash him into the abyss overnight. And those who mastered both sword and speech, like Caesar, were nearly unstoppable. But political games had consequences. The rivalry between Caesar and Pompey plunged the Republic into civil war. When Caesar triumphed, he didn't simply seek power, he sought permanence. He was declared dictator for life, a title that reeked of monarchy. To many senators, it was the final betrayal of the Republic's ideals. And so came the knives. On the Ides of March 44 BC, Brutus, Cassius, and their co-conspirators struck. They believed that by killing the man, they could restore the Republic. Yet their miscalculation was fatal. In removing Caesar, they unleashed chaos. His death didn't revive the Republic, it buried it. Why? Because Caesar had become the axis around which Rome revolved. Without him, rival factions scrambled for control. Antony, Octavian, Lepidus, the so-called Second Triumvirate, turned politics into a bloodbath. Proscriptions listed names for execution. Fortunes were confiscated, and even Cicero fell, his head and hands displayed as a warning. Rome was no longer governed by laws, it was ruled by fear.
What's striking about this period is that Rome's greatest defeats weren't suffered against foreign enemies, but against itself. Legions that once stood shoulder to shoulder at Cannae or Alesia now faced each other at Pharsalus and Philippi. Political intrigue had metastasized into full-scale civil wars. The final act came with Octavian, later Augustus. Patient, calculating, he outmaneuvered Antony, weaponizing propaganda to paint him as Cleopatra's puppet. At Actium in 31 BC, strategy and politics converged on the seas. Antony's fleet was broken, his cause doomed. Octavian didn't simply win a battle, he won the narrative. He declared the Republic restored. But in reality, he had replaced it with something new, the Principate, rule by a single man cloaked in republican forms.
So what does this tell us? Rome's military machine was unmatched, but its politics were its Achilles heel. Victory abroad only fueled rivalry at home. The more Rome conquered, the more wealth and armies its generals commanded, and the more the Republic's fragile balance collapsed. Consider what you would have done as a senator in this storm. Side with the Optimates, risking alienation from the people, or back the Populares, gambling that your chosen champion wouldn't become a tyrant. The truth is, no choice was safe. The political battlefield of Rome consumed even its brightest minds and bravest generals. The Republic's fall wasn't inevitable, but its leaders, blinded by ambition, made it so. And as the dust settled, Rome entered a new age, the Empire. But the question remained, was the Republic truly dead, or had it simply evolved into something more enduring?
Why did Rome, the greatest military machine of its age, stumble so catastrophically when facing enemies it once considered barbaric? The legions had conquered the Mediterranean, crushed Carthage, and even subdued the Hellenistic kingdoms of Alexander's successors. Yet in the forests of Germania, the deserts of Parthia, and the plains of Dacia, Rome would suffer humiliations that revealed the limits of imperial power. The empire's enemies were not passive victims of expansion. They adapted, learned Rome's methods, and struck back with devastating precision. Let's begin in Germania. In 9 CE, 3 Roman legions marched confidently into the Teutoburg forest under the command of Publius Quintilius Varus. His orders were simple: extend Roman control deeper into German territory, pacify the tribes, and prepare the region for incorporation into the empire. On parchment, it looked routine. Rome had done this countless times before. But unknown to Varus, one of his most trusted allies, a German noble named Arminius, was secretly plotting his betrayal. Why did Varus trust Arminius so completely? Because Arminius had served as a cavalry officer in the Roman army, even earning Roman citizenship. He understood the legionary system inside out, its strengths, its weaknesses, and its rigid dependence on discipline and formation. Varus believed Arminius was loyal, but in truth, the Germanic commander was weaving a trap that would forever scar Roman history.
As Varus's column stretched through the thick, rain-soaked forest, Arminius gave the signal. The Germanic warriors, hidden among the trees, descended upon the Romans with ferocious speed. The legions, unable to form their disciplined lines in the tangled terrain, were cut apart piece by piece. For 3 days, the slaughter continued. By the time it ended, nearly 20,000 Roman soldiers lay dead. Their standards were captured, their honor shattered. The Teutoburg disaster was more than a battlefield defeat. It was a strategic earthquake. Never again would Rome attempt to conquer Germania fully. The Rhine became the empire's permanent frontier, not by choice, but by necessity. Now, consider what you would have done if you were Varus. Would you have marched deep into unfamiliar territory, relying on the loyalty of men whose hearts lay with their homeland? Or would you have secured supply lines, fortified positions, and advanced cautiously? Rome's arrogance had blinded its leadership, and its enemies exploited that weakness brilliantly. But Germania was not the only frontier where Rome bled. In the east, the Parthian Empire presented a very different challenge. Unlike the tribal Germans, the Parthians commanded a sophisticated cavalry force that excelled in mobility and ranged combat. In 53 BCE, Marcus Licinius Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome and a member of the first triumvirate alongside Julius Caesar and Pompey, sought to cement his glory by conquering Parthia. He brought with him 7 legions, supported by auxiliaries and cavalry. Yet his ambition was matched only by his ignorance.
At Carrhae, Crassus faced the Parthian general Surena, who understood exactly how to counter Rome's heavy infantry. The Parthians unleashed a storm of arrows from their mounted archers, circling the Romans and raining death from a distance. The famed Parthian shot, firing backward while retreating at full gallop, proved devastating. The Roman formations, built for close combat, were helpless under this endless barrage. Crassus's cavalry, outnumbered and outmaneuvered, could not relieve the pressure. When the Romans attempted to advance, the Parthians feigned retreat, drawing them into traps before cutting them down. The result? Over 20,000 Romans killed, 10,000 captured, and Crassus himself executed in humiliation, molten gold poured down his throat, a cruel symbol of his greed. Carrhae taught Rome a painful lesson. Heavy infantry alone could not dominate every battlefield. Against swift cavalry armies, The legions were vulnerable. The East remained a bleeding frontier, contested for centuries. These defeats weren't just military embarrassments. They had profound political consequences. After Teutoburg, Augustus himself was said to have wandered the palace at night, crying, "Varus, give me back my legions." The emperor realized the empire's expansion had natural limits. After Carrhae, Rome's eastern ambitions were checked for decades, and Parthia remained a rival power Rome never fully subdued. Every military failure shifted Rome's strategic posture, forcing emperors to reconsider what was possible.
Yet Rome did not only lose. Its enemies struck hard, but the empire struck back. In the 2nd century CE, Emperor Trajan led a ferocious campaign against Dacia, the kingdom located in modern-day Romania. The Dacians, under their king Decebalus, had long harassed the Danube frontier. Skilled in mountain warfare and possessing fortified strongholds, they forced Rome to expend enormous resources to maintain control. Trajan, however, was determined to end the threat once and for all. The Dacian wars were not quick raids. They were vast, grinding campaigns of siege and maneuver. Roman engineers built massive bridges across the Danube to move legions deep into enemy territory. Siege engines battered Dacian fortresses, while Trajan himself personally led the assaults. After 2 brutal wars, Rome emerged victorious, annexing Dacia as a new province. The spoils were immense. Dacia's gold mines filled the Roman treasury, funding monumental projects like Trajan's Forum and Trajan's Column, which still depicts the campaign in vivid detail today. But beneath the triumph lay a sobering reality. Rome's enemies were no longer easily subdued. Each victory came at staggering cost in manpower and resources. And then came the Goths. In the 3rd and 4th centuries, waves of Germanic tribes pressed against Rome's borders. Some sought entry into the empire as allies and settlers, while others came as raiders and invaders. Rome, weakened by internal strife and overextended borders, could not easily distinguish friend from foe. The climax of this struggle came in 378 CE at the Battle of Adrianople, when Emperor Valens confronted the Gothic tribes. Overconfident and impatient, Valens attacked without waiting for reinforcements. It was a fatal miscalculation. The Goths, fighting with ferocity and tactical coordination, annihilated the Roman army. Valens himself perished on the field. Adrianople was more than a defeat. It was the beginning of the end. Historians often mark it as the moment the Western Roman Empire's fate was sealed.
But the story did not end there. The most terrifying enemy Rome would face arrived in the form of the Huns. Mounted warriors from the Eurasian steppes, led by the infamous Attila. To the Romans, the Huns seemed almost supernatural, fast-moving, ruthless, and devastating in their raids. Entire cities were burned, provinces ravaged. Rome bought temporary peace with gold, but each payment only emboldened Attila further. In 452, he marched into Italy itself, threatening Rome directly. Though disease, famine, and internal politics spared the city from total destruction, the psychological blow was immense. Rome, once the conqueror, had become the besieged. Varus's disaster in the Teutoburg forest, Crassus's humiliation at Carrhae, Valens' death at Adrianople, the terror of Attila's advance. Each moment revealed a fundamental truth. Rome's enemies had learned, adapted, and exploited weaknesses the empire refused to see. The legions, though unmatched in discipline, could not be everywhere at once. Rome's arrogance, overconfidence, and political instability magnified every defeat. And yet we must remember, for centuries after these catastrophes, the empire endured. Rome adapted its armies, recruited auxiliaries, integrated foreign tactics, and at times turned its enemies into allies. The empire bent, but it did not immediately break. That resilience
is perhaps the most remarkable lesson of all. But as the centuries wore on, the pressure mounted. Rome could win battles, but the tide of history was shifting against it.
So ask yourself, could Rome have survived if its leaders had been more cautious, more adaptable, less arrogant? Or was the empire always doomed once its enemies learned to strike back? Because as we'll see in the next section, Rome's greatest threat was not only the enemies at its borders, but the enemies within.
Why did Rome, the greatest military machine of the ancient world, turn its weapons upon itself? This is the question at the heart of Rome's long, bloody decline. For centuries, legions had conquered foreign enemies, marching under a banner of unity and shared destiny. But by the late Republic and early Empire, cracks began to appear, not from foreign invaders, but from within Rome itself. Political ambition, personal rivalry, and economic collapse poisoned the very foundations of Roman military power. Consider the moment after Julius Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE. The dagger thrusts that ended his life also ripped open the heart of Roman politics. Suddenly, generals no longer served the Senate or even Rome itself. They served themselves. Armies became private instruments of ambition, loyal to their commanders rather than the state. This shift would prove catastrophic. Take Mark Antony and Octavian, Caesar's heir. Their struggle for dominance wasn't just a political contest, it was a battle for the soul of the Roman legions. Soldiers who once fought shoulder to shoulder against Gauls and Parthians now turned their swords against fellow Romans. The climactic showdown at Actium in 31 BCE was less about naval tactics, though it had plenty of those, and more about who controlled the loyalty of men and resources. When Octavian triumphed, Rome became an empire in name as well as fact. But that victory carried a dangerous precedent. Emperors ruled not by tradition or law, but by force of arms.
Fast forward 2 centuries, and this precedent had become the empire's curse. By the 3rd century CE, Rome was trapped in what historians called the crisis of the 3rd century, a half-century of near-constant civil war. Rival emperors rose and fell at a dizzying pace. Some ruled for years, others for mere weeks. The legions, once disciplined instruments of strategy, became kingmakers, auctioning their swords to whichever ambitious general promised them the most coin. Stability collapsed. Borders went unguarded. Enemies surged across the Rhine and Danube, while in the east, the resurgent Persian Empire seized Rome's territory. The consequences were devastating. In 260 CE, Emperor Valerian marched east to confront the Persians, only to be captured alive, the first Roman emperor ever taken prisoner. His humiliating fate sent shockwaves across the empire. How had it come to this? The answer lay not just in the battlefield, but in the corridors of power. Rome's leaders could not stop fighting among themselves long enough to face their enemies.
Civil war wasn't just destructive, it was strategically suicidal. Each time one general marched on Rome, he stripped legions from the frontiers. Defenses weakened, and Germanic tribes poured into Gaul, raiding deep into Roman heartlands. The empire bled from both ends, consumed by internal struggles while foreign threats grew stronger. But the decay went deeper still. The economy buckled under the weight of endless wars. To pay the legions, emperors debased the currency, flooding the economy with worthless silver coins. Inflation spiraled, trade collapsed, and farmers abandoned their fields under crushing taxation. The empire that had once thrived on the spoils of conquest now struggled to feed itself. And yet behind this chaos lay human stories of ambition, betrayal, and tragic choices. Imagine being a legionary in this era. Whom do you serve? The Senate? The emperor in Rome? Or the charismatic general who promises victory in gold? Loyalty fractured, morale shattered.
What had once been Rome's greatest strength, its unity of purpose, became its fatal weakness.
One example is the bloody rivalry between Constantine and Maxentius in the early 4th century. Their battle at the Milvian Bridge wasn't just a clash of armies, it was a turning point in Roman faith and identity. Constantine, claiming divine vision, marched under the sign of the Christian cross. His victory didn't merely secure him the throne, it transformed Rome from a pagan empire to a Christian one. But again, this change came through civil war, Romans killing Romans on the banks of the Tiber. The tragic irony is clear. Rome's enemies often didn't need to defeat her. Rome was doing that job herself. Consider this. During the crisis of the 3rd century, the empire split into 3 rival states: the Gallic Empire in the west, the Palmyrene Empire in the east, and the official Roman Empire in Italy all claimed legitimacy. For nearly 15 years, Rome existed as a fractured shadow of its former self. Unity had to be painfully restored by the Emperor Aurelian, who earned the title Restitutor Orbis, restorer of the world. Yet even his victories only delayed the inevitable. Strategically, Rome had fallen into a trap of its own making. Civil wars trained legions to fight each other instead of barbarians. Political instability drained resources from the frontier. Economically, debased currency and broken trade networks meant the empire could no longer sustain its massive military machine. Every solution seemed to create a new problem. When emperors strengthened one frontier, another collapsed. When they bought loyalty with coin, the currency weakened further.
What would you have done standing in the sandals of a Roman general? Imagine you're stationed on the Rhine. Word arrives that a rival emperor has declared himself in Rome, and your soldiers urge you to march south to claim the throne yourself. Do you abandon the frontier and leave your people to barbarian raids? Or do you stay, knowing another general will seize power instead? This was the impossible dilemma of Roman commanders, and most chose ambition over duty. By the late 4th century, civil war had become a grim tradition. Emperors rose and fell with alarming speed, often slain by their own guards. Meanwhile, Gothic tribes pressed harder into the Balkans. When the Emperor Valens rashly confronted them at the Battle of Adrianople in 378 CE, he made a fateful mistake, one rooted in the arrogance and desperation of a fractured empire. His army was annihilated, and Valens himself was killed. Rome had lost not just a battle, but the aura of invincibility that had shielded her for centuries. The story of Rome's internal decay is not merely one of decline. It's a lesson in the cost of disunity. Rome did not fall in a single day, nor to a single enemy. It rotted from within, consumed by civil wars that bled its strength away. When the final blows came from Goths, Vandals, and Huns, the empire was already hollowed out. And yet, the drama of these internal struggles remains compelling. The ambition of generals, the desperation of emperors, the shifting loyalties of legions. These were the forces that shaped Rome's destiny as surely as any barbarian spear. But the question remains, having torn itself apart from the inside, could Rome still summon the strength to face the storm gathering on its borders? Or had centuries of civil war doomed the empire to collapse long before its enemies struck the final blow?
Why did the mighty Roman Empire, once unchallenged across the Mediterranean, finally crumble in the West? The answer lies in the perfect storm of internal decay, economic collapse, and relentless pressure from external enemies. For centuries, Rome had expanded, conquered, and absorbed other peoples. Yet by the 4th and 5th centuries CE, the empire faced foes unlike any before: enemies who understood Roman tactics, exploited its weaknesses, and struck when Rome could least respond. The first and perhaps most shocking blow came from the Goths, who had long lived on Rome's northern frontiers. Pressure from the advancing Huns forced these tribes into Roman territory, seeking refuge and land. The empire, weakened by decades of civil war and mismanagement, allowed them to settle, hoping to assimilate them. But assimilation failed. The Goths, skilled warriors accustomed to independence, resisted control. Tensions rose until rebellion became inevitable. In 378 CE, Emperor Valens made a fateful decision. He would confront the Gothic forces at Adrianople. The strategic question was simple yet deadly: strike before the Goths could fully organize, or risk letting them consolidate power. Valens chose aggression over caution. Unknown to him, the Gothic army had gathered superior numbers and used their cavalry to devastating effect. When battle commenced, Roman infantry were encircled, cut down en masse, and the emperor himself perished on the battlefield.
Adrianople was more than a military defeat. It was a psychological catastrophe. For the first time, Rome's invincibility was shattered in the field. Generals and soldiers alike realized that the legions could be defeated decisively, and the empire's northern borders would never again be secure. The Gothic victory set off a chain reaction. Tribes across Gaul, Hispania, and Italy sensed opportunity. The Vandals, Suebi, and Alans began raiding Roman provinces, often with alarming coordination. In 406 CE, vast groups crossed the frozen Rhine, overwhelming Roman defenses. The empire's frontier garrisons were stretched too thin. Civil war had left many legions loyal to ambitious commanders rather than the emperor. This internal weakness meant that barbarian incursions often met only token resistance. And then came the Huns, led by the fearsome Attila. Unlike other barbarian groups, the Huns were a highly mobile force, striking fast and retreating before Roman armies could respond. Their invasions of Gaul and Italy in the mid-5th century were devastating, leaving cities burned and populations terrorized. Rome, unable to field effective field armies, resorted to diplomacy, paying tribute to keep Attila at bay. Yet every payment emboldened him further. By 452 CE, Attila was marching toward the city itself, a grim reminder that Rome could no longer dictate terms on its own soil.
While external forces attacked, Rome's internal stability continued to unravel. Emperors were puppets of generals, bureaucracies faltered, and tax revenues collapsed. The Western Empire became increasingly reliant on foederati, barbarian mercenaries who served Rome in exchange for land or pay. This created a dangerous feedback loop. The empire needed barbarian soldiers to defend against barbarian raids. Loyalties were fragile, and commanders sometimes switched sides, further destabilizing the system. By the early 5th century, the Western Empire was a shadow of its former self. In 410 CE, Alaric and the Visigoths sacked Rome. This was a moment that stunned the world. The Eternal City, once untouchable, fell to what many considered barbarians. Strategic mistakes, poor leadership, and decades of systemic decay made the sack possible. The images of burning temples, looted palaces, and terrified citizens left an indelible mark on history. Rome was alive, but its aura of invincibility was gone forever. The decline accelerated. In 455 CE, the Vandals under Genseric captured and sacked the city again, leaving destruction and fear in their wake. By 476 CE, the Western Roman Empire's last emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by the Germanic chieftain Odoacer. The Western Roman Empire ceased to exist as a political entity.
Yet it is crucial to understand that this fall was not sudden. It was the culmination of centuries of strain. Military overreach, civil war, economic collapse, and the integration of barbarian populations created vulnerabilities that Rome's enemies could exploit. Each invasion, raid, and battle was both a symptom and a cause of the empire's decline. Tactically, Rome had once relied on disciplined legions, strict formations, and engineering ingenuity. But by the 5th century, many of these advantages were eroded. Armies were smaller, less disciplined, and often composed of mercenaries with divided loyalties. Strategic planning became impossible when emperors were weak and generals acted independently. Rome's traditional battlefield dominance could no longer compensate for political and economic collapse. The human dimension of this collapse is also striking. Imagine the lives of citizens in Gaul or Italy during these invasions. Peasants fled farms, cities were abandoned, and local garrisons were powerless to stop marauding armies. Soldiers, once the pride of the Republic, faced enemies they had no loyalty to or knowledge of. Families were displaced, and centuries of Roman culture and governance were uprooted.
Even as the West fell, the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium, continued to survive. Strategically, the East learned from the West's mistakes. Stronger fortifications, centralized bureaucracy, and careful diplomacy allowed Constantinople to endure for nearly 1,000 more years. This contrast highlights one of Rome's most important lessons. Survival depends not only on military might, but on political cohesion, economic resilience, and strategic foresight. Archaeological evidence reinforces this narrative. Excavations in Gaul and Italy reveal abandoned forts, destroyed villas, and hastily buried cities. Coins, weapon fragments, and human remains tell the story of an empire under relentless pressure. These findings corroborate the written sources, showing that Rome's fall was a process of attrition as much as decisive battles. Consider this. If you were a Roman commander in 410 CE, faced with Alaric's advancing forces and no reinforcements, what would you do? Fight a hopeless battle? Negotiate surrender? Or abandon the city? Every choice carried risk. Every decision could accelerate collapse. This is the strategic nightmare Rome faced repeatedly in its final centuries.
Ultimately, the fall of the Western Roman Empire is a story of both inevitability and contingency. External enemies exploited weaknesses, but those weaknesses were created internally. Rome's legions, once invincible, were fractured by politics. Its economy, once vibrant, was drained by decades of mismanagement. Its borders, once secure, were exposed by civil war. And when the barbarians came, they did not topple a fully functional empire. They swept aside a house already weakened by internal rot. And yet, even in defeat, Rome left a legacy that would shape the world for millennia. Roads, laws, architecture, and governance systems that survived long after the Western Empire's collapse. The lessons of strategic overreach, political fragility, and the importance of adaptable military structures remain relevant today, a testament to both Rome's greatness and its vulnerabilities. So, as we reflect on the fall of the West, one question remains. Had Rome been politically unified, economically robust, and militarily disciplined, could it have repelled the barbarians entirely? Or was the weight of centuries of expansion and internal decay already too great to overcome? The answers are as complex as the empire itself.
What lessons can we truly learn from Rome's extraordinary history? The story of the Roman Empire is more than a tale of battles won and lost. It is a study in power, strategy, ambition, and human nature. From the legion's disciplined formations to the treacherous politics of the Senate, Rome's rise and fall offers timeless insights for military leaders, politicians, and citizens alike. Rome achieved greatness because it mastered the art of organization and strategy. Its legions, meticulously trained and ruthlessly disciplined, dominated battlefields across continents. Every soldier knew his role. Every commander understood logistics, terrain, and timing. Rome's victories were rarely accidental. They were the product of planning, adaptation, and the relentless pursuit of excellence. Yet, as we have seen, the very same strengths could be undermined by weakness at home. Internal decay, civil war, political rivalry, and economic collapse proved far deadlier than any barbarian army. The Teutoburg Forest, Carrhae, Adrianople, and the sack of Rome were not isolated tragedies. They were symptoms of a systemic collapse, a lesson that no empire can endure if it undermines its own foundations. Discipline and tactical genius cannot compensate for political instability and fractured loyalty.
Modern parallels are striking. Military powers today still confront the challenge of balancing professional forces with political oversight. Civil unrest, bureaucratic inefficiency, and economic strain can sap even the most formidable armies of their effectiveness. The Roman experience reminds us that strategy is not just about weapons and troops. It is about governance, culture, and foresight. Leaders who ignore these lessons risk repeating history's mistakes. Rome's enemies were also teachers. Germanic tribes, Parthian cavalry, Dacian fortresses, and the Huns demonstrated adaptability and cunning. They exploited terrain, mobility, and timing to overcome superior numbers or equipment. Today, asymmetric warfare continues to challenge modern militaries in the same way. The past teaches that adaptability, intelligence, and understanding the enemy's motivations are as crucial as brute force. Equally important are the human stories behind the history. Generals, senators, and ordinary soldiers faced impossible choices, each decision carrying life and death consequences. Loyalty fractured, ambition clashed with duty, and courage was often overshadowed by circumstance. Studying these personal stakes helps us understand that history is not just a sequence of events. It is shaped by human decisions, character, and fallibility.
Archaeological evidence reinforces the narrative, revealing abandoned fortifications, destroyed cities, and mass graves. These findings are reminders that even the mightiest empire leaves tangible traces of both glory and failure. They challenge us to examine not just the legend of Rome, but the reality of its vulnerabilities. As we look to the present, the Roman example remains instructive. Nations rise and fall not only on battlefields, but within their institutions. Economic stability, political cohesion, and strategic adaptability are essential for lasting power. Military innovation alone cannot sustain an empire. Governance, law, and societal resilience are equally critical. And yet, there is inspiration as well as warning. Rome endured for centuries,
shaped the course of civilization and left legacies in law, engineering, language, and culture that endure to this day. Even in its fall, the empire teaches us that human ingenuity and organization can achieve remarkable heights, but only if ambition is balanced with prudence and strength is paired with foresight.
So, as we conclude this exploration of Roman history, consider the ultimate lesson. Greatness is fragile, power is transient, and history rewards those who understand both the art of war and the subtle strategies of governance. Rome's warriors, politicians, and citizens lived, struggled, and died within a system that was both magnificent and perilously vulnerable. Their story reminds us that strategy, discipline, and adaptability are timeless imperatives, whether on the battlefield of the ancient world or in the complex arenas of modern life. The empire fell in the West, yet the lessons of Rome live on. The legion's discipline, the genius of Roman engineering, and the consequences of political miscalculation continue to resonate. By studying Rome, we do not merely relive the past, we prepare ourselves to recognize the patterns of ambition, strategy, and vulnerability that shape every civilization.